Hello, it's Carrie Bible welcoming you to yet another episode of Hollywood Kitchen. And today I have a very special return guest, Miss Lora Stocker from Ava Gardner's hometown in Smithfield, North Carolina. Lora was my guest for the Christmas Eve Ava Gardner cheese ball episode. And there are so many Ava Gardner recipes that Lora has generously sent me. So I couldn't resist doing another one, and we're going to do another and another and another. So lots of food and fabulousness coming from Ava Gardner and Lora. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.
I did a poll on Twitter and Facebook to see I thought it'd be fun to do it that way, just to see what people had to say. And I posted succotash and what else did I post? Succotash, the blueberry buckle, okra and rice, and several things, but a lot of people seemed a little befuddled by what succotash was. They seemed repulsed about the lima bean thing. Yes. So it's like by a gigantic margin, the blueberry buckle was the victor here in the Ava Gardner Derby. So so that's what we're going to make today.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was funny to, you and I were talking earlier that a lot of the other two recipes were very kind of with a lot of Southern vegetables that are very common in the Southern diet. Okra's very common. Lima beans, full disclosure, are one of my favorite vegetables. We had them at every family meal. I would always say, Dad, make the lima beans. And now I do that with and I've introduced it more and more to my family over time, but my extended family. But yeah, it was funny to see people be like, okra, no, or lima beans, no. So definitely the sweet option was the winner this time around. So we'll see about, maybe next time we'll try to convince everybody that okra and lima beans are winners too.
Yeah,
so.
Or much like a vegetable, we may just have to foist it upon the world, and they're just gonna have to deal with it like a lot of us did as little kids.
Yeah, they have to eat it.
It's funny, I grew up in Texas and then my family moved to Georgia, and we always ate okra. And you cannot find, at least I can't, fresh okra in Los Angeles. It's like impossible for me to find. So I have to buy it frozen. But whenever I go home to Georgia, usually once or twice a year, I eat like my body weight in okra. I eat so much okra when I'm home because I miss it, But now I wanted to address the blueberry buckle issue because people might get confused between, say, a coffee cake or a cobbler, or what is a buckle? So explain for us what makes this a buckle.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, until going through some family recipes and some recipes that belong to the museum, the Ava Gardner Museum, I had no clue. I'd never heard of a buckle. In my part of North Carolina, rural North Carolina, where I was born and raised and live now, everything was a cobbler. You just kind of called it that.
Yeah,
for the most part. And there's kind of this rich tradition that started all the way back in kind of from colonial times of creating kind of a deep dish fruit dessert. Sometimes, they actually would eat this for breakfast. Sometimes it's like kind of an appetizer, first course kind of thing. But there's a series of different types of dishes, and that kind of, got named various things for kind of how the dough, what type of dough you use, what type of fruit you use, and the relation of the dough to the fruit. So whether the dough's on the top, the bottom, the sides, layers in between, that's kind of how you distinguish between all of these desserts. And as you mentioned, there's the cobbler, there's what we're going to prepare today, which is the buckle. There's things called grunts and slumps and pandowdies, which some of us may know from the song, shoe fly pie and apple pandowdy. You may have heard it in that. And then there's Betty's, crisps, crumbles, all sorts of, and there's actually a special one that I'll talk about a little bit too in North Carolina that is specific to one county, one in our 100 counties. It's one county, Surrey County, actually, where Andy Griffith is from. They have their own unique kind of interpretation of a cobbler, and it's called a sonker, S-O-N-K-E-R. So these, and I'm sure if you ask anybody from any other state, they'd say, oh, well, we've got one and it's called this. So there's just a multitude of these, but basically all of these kind of fall within kind of a deep dish dessert. And they vary from having, so a cobbler is typically like the true cobbler. And the reason it's called a cobbler is because you have your dish, you put your fruit in the bottom, and then you do like a drop biscuit dough at the top, and it looks kind of like cobblestones. So that's one explanation of why it was called a cobbler. They have, there are other things that are very common, a crisp or a crumble, which is very similar to what my family called it a cobbler, but it was really more of a crisp or crumble, where you'd have the fruit on the bottom, and then you'd have some sort of kind of topping, either a streusel topping, or which was more like a crumble, or a crisp, which has oats or nuts mixed in with the streusel. So it has a bit of a crunch. And lots of times a crisp, in particular around here, at least in North Carolina, is prepared with apples, more so than kind of any other fruit. But the buckle is a really interesting one because it has basically like a cake batter. It's a little thicker than a cake batter, almost kind of like in between somewhere like a cake and a blondie batter, and it kind of ends up doing that. And you line the bottom of your baking dish with this batter, and then you sprinkle your fruit of choice. In this recipe, we're going to use blueberries, but lots of times it was based off of what was in season. So whatever seasonal fruits you had, you sprinkle that on top of it. And then this recipe includes a kind of a streusel mix that you just kind of dollop, or a crumble mix. It really turned, you and I we both practiced making this, and both of us, it turns more like a sort of a streusel, but it worked. And you just kind of daub it on the top after you've done your blueberries, and you bake it. And the cake batter at the bottom rises up, and the blueberries sort of sink down and burst as they heat up. So and then the streusel melts within that. So when it's finished, it almost has like a little bit of a blondie taste or a muffin taste, but maybe a little denser than that. So I thought it was a really great dessert, and really was pleased with how it turned out. The dish that I mentioned that's unique to North Carolina, the sonker, the way that it differs is it uses a pastry crust like you'd use in a pie crust. And you have your same kind of large baking dish, and you line the edges, and then you fill it with a fruit that you have pre-cooked a little bit with sugar. So the fruit is very sweet and juicy. It's a lot more liquidy than a traditional cobbler. And then you take that same pastry dough and you pull it into strips, and you can either do a lattice work or you just kind of drop it, and the fruit bubbles up into it. And they say that the pastry dough sinks, or as they call it, sonks down. So that's where they think that's where it gets the name of sonker. So it's just neat to kind of learn a little more about these dishes and see how, they're sometimes regionally specific, or have, where the roots of their names come from, and all the little variations of them. And hopefully when folks watch our episode today, they'll write us and say, oh, well, I'm from this state and we have this dish. I would love to learn about more of these regional dishes.
I remember as a little girl in Texas, we had a thing called Mississippi mud cake. Mm-hmm. It was like this chocolate and marshmallow and fudge, and it was real gooey and sticky and sugary, but I haven't seen that since I was a kid. But I definitely remember anytime we had a church social event, Mississippi mud cake would be present.
Mm-hmm. Well, this dish, you mentioned that, and we were kind of talking about the meanings of food and how food can be such a uniting force and such a way to learn about different cultures and societies and customs of regions and things. And this dish is very much a dish like that you would take to a church potluck, or when you had a big family gathering, you would put together this type of dish. I was telling you kind of in our little pre-conversation that the cobbler, as my family called it, typically was with blueberries. And we had that we would have kind of a Sunday supper with my extended family, grandparents, and that sort of thing, just about every week growing up. And my dad, if we didn't have something else planned or something else that, special that was made, it was like, oh, let's put together a quick cobbler. And it was typically, fruit on the bottom, some sort of crumble, and pop it in the oven, a real easy dessert, but that was always delicious.
I grew up eating a lot of peach cobbler because peaches are such a huge thing in Texas and Georgia. And my mom is really also into doing the putting up the preserves. So my mom will put them up and then have them in the freezer too. So there's always a plentiful supply of peaches on hand.
That's great. Yeah, and that's an easy way. You have them in the jar ready to go. You just bring them out any time of year, pour them in your baking dish and add your topping and you're good to go.
That's what Mama does. Now
Yeah.
this one says Myra's blueberry buckle on the, I printed out the recipe card that you sent me. So wondering, was this Ava's mother's recipe?
No, so Ava's mother was named Mary Elizabeth Gardner. Her nickname, or kind of was commonly known as Molly. And within the family was Molly Gardner, or Mama Gardner, excuse me. And they had several children. They had two sons, one who died as an infant who's very small. There was an accident and he passed away, but then they had another son, Jack. And then they had their eldest daughter was Beatrice, then Inez, I think I'm getting the order right, or no, Elsie Mae, Inez, and then Myra. And then 7 years later was baby Ava. So she was, there was quite an age difference. In fact, when she was born, I believe the eldest child was Beatrice, or nicknamed Bappy, is a nickname Ava gave her because she couldn't say Beatrice. And Bappy was, I think, either 18 or 19, I think 19 when Ava was born. So there was a really large age difference. So she had, in addition to her parents, she had siblings who were sort of parental figures sometimes and sort of treated her that way a little bit. But so this is a recipe that Myra and her family contributed to the museum when the museum several years ago had put together a cookbook. It's currently out of print, but hopefully one day it'll be back in print.
And I would buy that in a heartbeat, and I know a lot of people who watch will as well.
Yeah, I want it too. I hope that we do at some point get it updated. And there's other recipes. The cheese ball recipe that we prepared last time, that's a newer recipe that could be included in it. And then several other recipes that have been handed down. But Mama Gardner was quite the cook. She was known, if you read Ava Gardner's biography or autobiography, Ava My Story, or some of the other books that were written by people close to her or close to the family, they'll say that Mama Gardner was the best cook in the whole county. And she was quite known for that. And she seemed to love to cook. In fact, I was looking back through Ava's autobiography the other day, and she was talking about how every day her mom would clean the entire house. So it was ready to go if anybody stopped by, and it was spotless except for the kitchen. The kitchen was just always, flour everywhere and sugar everywhere, whatever, because she was always baking and cooking and making large meals. And, they were, when Ava was born, her parents were farmers. They grew cotton and tobacco, and that was that was kind of this where she was born was a largely, and still is, a largely agrarian area. And you can just envision kind of everybody chipping in and working in the field, her husband and everybody, the children and others working in the fields all day and coming in for lunch or for dinner and having kind of a great big home cooked meal to kind of get rejuvenate after all of that. So you can see kind of where all that cooking came from. And Ava said that her mother had one cookbook, and it was, and I've not looked for it, I want to try and find it, but it was an older edition of the White House cookbook. And it was like this, and she swore by it and said, in addition to the recipes that she just kind of innately knew how to cook, or that were passed down to her from her mother and grandmother in previous generations, but she loved that cookbook, and then she just had a real natural instinct for cooking. And that seemed to carry over to all of the children. They all had recipes that over time they did contribute some to the museum. And this one in particular was one that her closest sister in age, Myra, had created, or was one of her specialties. So it's neat to share this, knowing that it came, it was within the family.
Oh yeah. Well, another question, we were talking about this off camera, but I want to talk about it on camera too, because as I keep saying, every one of these episodes, I learned something. Sometimes it is the hard way, but I learned something. And when I made it the other day, I just used the flour that I already had in my little home here, which was the all-purpose flour. Now, my final result for that other day was it's a bit dense, it's a bit, thick. And then I looked and it says self-rising flour. I must have missed that on the recipe. So I went to the store this morning, and the only self-rising flour they had available was in these gigantic bags. And I just thought, I can't justify doing that because I don't need that much. And it's just kind of crazy. It's going to go to waste. I don't want that. So what I'm wondering, and if any of you that know a lot more about baking than me can weigh in on this, I was thinking about adding a little bit of yeast to it to see if that would help with the rising factor here. So I'm gonna try that. Fingers crossed this does not end in disaster. So let's hope for a good result.
Well, that, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I know when you post the video later and you put it on your website, you'll include the details of the recipe. We can go over all the ingredients too in more detail, but it does specify in one spot self-rising flour. And honestly, I didn't realize that until I was prepping for this and kind of going, okay, I need to make it at least once to know what I'm doing. And my oven tends to always run a little hot, so I'm always kind of not cooking something to the full time a recipe says. So I always want to monitor that and make sure I get it right, so I can calibrate that in my pre-cook. But yeah, so part of it you do ultimately need both, or some sort of flour that's we're going to get a rise to it. I was joking with you. I said, I hope we don't have the oven explode with this huge, something straight out of a comedy movie or something. But yeah, so part of it does require self-rising and then all purpose. So that's something we'll note when you share this on your website, and we'll let everybody know how the yeast turns out.
For better or worse, we will let
For better or worse, yeah.
So you ready for me to start making it?
Yeah, let's start. So we both have preheated our oven.
Okay.
So that's step one, and we can tell everybody that you preheat your oven to 375, and then I'm going to make it with you. So I've got all my stuff.
Oh, okay, great.
I'm going to start with what on the recipe is called the filling, but what would be kind of that bottom cake type, layer of this. So I'll get my bowl.
Okay.
And let me look. I'll have to look at this. So it says, first of all, we're going to take butter, which is hopefully already at room temperature or a little melted, and we're going to mix that, cream that together with let's see how much, 1/3 of a cup of sugar.
1/3 of a cup of sugar. I'm trying to move all these bowls out of the way as I make stuff here.
Yeah, I tried to be
It's not totally melted, but it's not totally liquidy either. It's sort of in between at this point.
Mm-hmm. I tried to prep for this I'm going to be on, I was on Food Network or something, and have all my stuff pre-measured. And since there's so much measuring to do.
Yeah, I try to do that too, because I figure people don't want to see me sit here running around trying to figure out my measurements and stuff. So.
And I'll say I don't have a hand mixer, which I need to get. I used to have one and then it broke and I've not replaced it. So when I was making it in the pre-thing, I used a whisk, and then I got it all in the little things of the whisk, So I was like, I don't want to try. I want to just use a spoon or a spatula or something today, and that seems to work. So so it looks like I've got mine fairly well mixed. How about you?
Yeah, the butter's a little, oh, your butter's way more melted than mine. Shoot. I wonder if I should put this on the stove for a minute or something.
Or do you have a microwave?
I do. It's in the other room. My place is small, so my microwave and fridge are literally down the hallway. So yeah, if you want to hang on just a sec, I'm gonna go try to heat this up.
Yep.
Okay, update. I nuked the butter a little bit, and now it's much creamier. It's really much more sweetly, which is great.
That looks great. So it says the next things we need to do are add vanilla, and it requires 1 teaspoon of vanilla.
Okay, got my 1 teaspoon of vanilla right here.
Cheers. And then 1 egg.
Okay. Egg right here. I always crack it in a separate bowl just in case, so I don't get eggshell and stuff.
Me too. I'm horrible with getting eggshell. I was telling you earlier that I love to cook and try to cook quite a bit, but especially since the pandemic started, I cook a lot. But baking's kind of a blind spot for me. I haven't done a lot of baking, and I don't kind of instinctively have a good handle on it. But I try. I enjoy it, but I have to really follow the recipe, to hopefully have it turned out right.
I've heard the saying that cooking is an art, but baking is a science. So I don't know if I got that right, but I think that's the gist of it.
That may be the reason. I'm more artistic than naturally artistic than naturally scientific. Although I love science, but
Okay, now it says add flour.
yes. So with the flour, it recommends kind of alternating between adding the flour and adding the milk. And so
Okay.
it's, for the filling, it is 1 cup of self-rising flour, and then a third of a cup of milk.
So should I kind of alternate? So you said alternate between adding
I
them?
would say maybe like half your flour, and then half the milk, and then the other half. That's a good enough.
Back and forth. Now, dare I add the yeast packet at this point?
It's gonna just be a journey for both of us because
I journey.
I don't know that I mean my husband has done probably more baking than I have, and I've seen him with the yeast packets, and I'm in awe of that because I've never tried making bread or anything. My sister has gotten really into bread making since the pandemic. I know a lot of people have.
At one point in LA here, like when I was first starting these Hollywood Kitchen episodes, you couldn't find flour, you couldn't find yeast. Like it's like all of LA did a run on bread baking. Going to the stores here for a while was absolutely bonkers because there were so many things you could not find. It was really surreal. Okay, so I've added my milk and my flour, and I did add, I would say an entire packet of yeast, maybe about a half a packet. So we're just gonna see how this winds up here.
We're just gonna see.
I kind of am interested to do a comparison and contrast with how these turned out versus how the other day's batch turned out, and see what difference this made.
Okay, I think mine's one of the things, like I said earlier, that I was surprised by this. I mean, I have made cakes. I have a very kind of a family pound cake recipe. Pound cakes are very popular down here and in this part of the state. And I have a very easy pound cake recipe that I make from time to time. But this has a thicker consistency than a kind of pound cake or just a basic cake recipe. So don't be alarmed at that when you see it. That's what it's supposed to be like.
Okay.
And I don't know we'll see what the yeast does to it.
Yeah, I'm gonna be real curious to see how this one turns out. But all right, so I've got my batter here.
Yeah, that's great. So now we need to get our pan and grease it before we put anything in it. So
I did that in advance here.
Oh, you beat me to it. So I'm gonna do that.
I'm gonna put it on a cookie sheet because after the Cary Grant pie episode, I learned my lesson. I had just put the pie in the oven without being on a cookie sheet, and it bubbled over, and my entire bottom of my oven was covered in stuff. And it took me days to get it out of there. And yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna spray so you're gonna hear a little sound for a second. And you can use whatever size baking dish you have, deep dish baking dish. I just got a kind of a disposable one, an aluminum one from the grocery store. So, but grease your sides because it will go up the sides a little bit. Like that. And now you just take your cake mixture or filling, as it's called in the recipe, and put it in the pan. And then once you get it in there, kind of dump it in the middle and then spread it out to the edges. So it covers the bottom of whatever size dish you're using. So did you grow up, your mom, did she cook a lot, and your dad?
Yeah, my mom cooks, and then my dad is really into barbecuing, and so my dad welds actually too, and he welded a whole barbecue cooker out in the yard, and Dad was always cooking like chicken or steak or burgers, and Dad was really into that. And sometimes my dad has certain specialties that he's like really proud of making, and my mom is an outstanding cook. It's kind of funny because when I've gone home sometimes I'll watch her like a hawk, and I'll make a recipe back here in LA exactly like she did it. It still doesn't taste as good as the way she did it. And I'll be like, what am I doing wrong? I don't know if maybe it's because Mama made it. It just naturally tastes so much better,
Well, kind of looking at, I grew up, like I said, we lived in a rural community in eastern North Carolina, a little town called Roseboro, very small town, still is a very small town. And there weren't a lot of restaurants. So you cooked a lot. And both of my parents loved to cook. My late father was a really great cook. And as I told you last time in our episode, my parents, in addition to owning their own florist, catered a lot. So we cooked and were, doing that as a business in addition to kind of family sustenance. And it sounds a lot like Ava was like that to some degree. She and her siblings were kind of, the kitchen was definitely the heart of the house and was a big part of kind of their memories as a family. Their time together as a family was around food, around cooking, and sharing dishes. And I think that's so special, those kinds of memories of growing up and, remembering kind of what your family's special dishes were or what you had at every kind of family gathering and that sort of thing. And then, carrying that down to the next generation is always really neat. And that's the neat thing about these recipes. I mean, I don't know that this recipe originated with Mama Gardner, but, Myra had it, and it certainly could have been something that her mother cooked and passed down. So, okay, so I've got mine. Okay. All my bottom of my line looks great. So now we take our blueberries, which I think we both pre-washed, and then you just kind of sprinkle them across the top. Just trying to get some in every part of the dish.
Yeah, it's amazing how food connects us, but also how it brings back memories. Like there's certain smells or certain foods I eat, and it takes me like right back to different places I traveled to, different friends in my life, different experiences growing up,
Have you ever seen Ratatouille?
Yes.
My husband and I always talk about the moment when he serves Ratatouille to the critic, and the critic has that flashback to being a little boy. And we talk about that with food all the time, that you'll have certain smells or certain dishes that you taste, and it just totally is a transformative that transports you back to that moment, to that memory, and just remembering great food that, whenever I travel, I try to always find out, okay, what's the regional thing here? What's the specialty? So I can try that and know that I've had whatever that dish is.
It's funny, I went to college in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the food there is so spectacular, the kind of New Mexican style food. And I have literally, over the 21 years I've now lived in Los Angeles, I have gone to every place I can find to try to find that taste. And I find it.
Can't do it.
So specific, to that area.
Absolutely. And, with North Carolina, that's one of the things when we have friends that come, when they can, from out of town, who have not been here, we try to make sure that, if you're going to be here a few days, there's certain things, if you eat meat, you have to have Eastern or Western style barbecue. There's two distinct styles of barbecue in North Carolina. There's certain dishes like the sonker that we were talking about. There in that county, there's a whole trail that's been built around it's called the Sonker Trail, and you can try different kinds of sonkers all through the county, and then of course with the coast, we have a very kind of a lightly fried seafood is called calabash style seafood. And that's a name that's that's left the state, but it's based off the kind of cooking in this really small little beach community called Calabash. And that type of preparation has just been exported and become kind of synonymous with that area, but it's a very much a regional style food. And it's this really small little town that just happened to cook really great seafood. So it's so neat to kind of, when you're traveling, to go beyond just kind of seeing the sights, but to get to taste the place and get the flavors of a place, because that tells you a lot about the people.
Absolutely.
So we've got our blueberries in. That's what mine looks like. Now we need to make our topping. So I'm going to set that to the side. And this requires half a cup of sugar, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, a half a cup of butter, and a third of a cup of all-purpose flour. So,
okay,
what you got first? Your cinnamon.
All right, I got the sugar and the cinnamon together.
And this you can kind of just dump it all in and blend it together, I think. I don't know that that's a big, because what we're trying to do is make this a little more like a streusel or a crumble. So if your butter is not quite as soft as it was for the first, that's actually good for this.
Good. I love it. Okay.
A crumble. And a little trick, or at least something I do when I'm trying to make a crumble topping, as opposed to using a spoon, if you have a fork, using that, because it'll make, you'll have kind of the lines and indentations, and it'll make it a little more crumble texture wise than it
I'm
will.
gonna get a fork. I'll be right back.
Because you
That's
don't
a really good tip. Thank you. I would not have known this.
So you don't want this to be creamed like the filling that we made. You want this to be sort of loose if you can and somewhat crumbly.
Okay.
How's that fork working for you?
It's okay. It's okay. The butter's still fairly hard though, so not fair. I mean, yeah, it's gonna take a bit of mashing up here to kind of get it all blended in, I think.
And it doesn't have to be 100% incorporated either.
Real okay, that's good to know.
Because when the filling rises and the blueberries start to sort of burst, it'll all sort of incorporate, when the oven does its magic.
Okay.
So I'll show you kind of what mine looks like, and this is sort of what we're looking for. So I don't know how well you can see that, but you see how it's kind of crumbly?
Yeah, this is kind of how mine's looking.
Yeah, that's looking good. That's looking
Oh, it
good.
is. Oh, very good. Okay. I was worried it was too dry and powdery.
No, that'll be fine because the butter will melt and it'll all mix together once it heats up.
Excellent.
Okay. So now once we got that done, we'll get back to our baking dish. And basically you just daub it or sprinkle it kind of, here, there, and everywhere until you get a little, just like with the blueberries, until you get a little bit everywhere.
Okay, we'll do that right now. By the way, I know this is a dessert, but I actually had a little bit of this for breakfast this morning. I just had a little plate of fruit and a little square of this. So I think it could actually double as a breakfast pastry as well.
You're absolutely right. And as we were saying earlier, these types of dessert go back to early settlers, colonial times and all, when they came to this country and didn't have necessarily the same ingredients they had back in their, in England or wherever they came from. They would improvise and say, oh, well, I have a little biscuit dough left and I have some fruit. Let me take some fruit and just plop this biscuit dough on there. Or I have just a little bit of butter left or milk left or whatever. And that's kind of where these types of dishes originated. And they would be served for breakfast. As I mentioned, they could be served as kind of an appetizer. And it wasn't until about the kind of mid to late 19th century that they became more of a dessert type dish. Okay.
All right, here's how mine looks.
Oh, it looks delicious. And I'll show you, here's my end result. So see, I still have some kind of, where there's spots that it's just the flour and the sugar and the cinnamon mix, where it's not even got butter in it, but that butter will distribute throughout. So are we ready to go in the oven?
Ready to go in the oven.
Right. So like I said, my oven is a little temperamental. So I set my timer for 35 minutes. That seemed to work well when I did the pre-cook. And, but the recipe does say 50 minutes. So I would just say, monitor it and kind of adjust it based off your own oven.
Okay, and let me show you what the final result looked like of my first attempt the other day of making this, so you can see. Can you see that very well in the light? Or
a little bit. Yeah, I can see. And it does kind of have like a coffee cake look to it, doesn't it?
Very much so. Like when I first bit into it, I thought, well, this is like coffee cake with blueberries in it, basically. So.
which is a great thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you want to talk about Ava for the next 50 minutes, or should we just talk about Ava and then we can post pictures later of the food? Like, how would you?
We can do whatever you like. I'm always game to talk about Ava, so we can talk about her for a little bit, and we can wait if you want to. We can wait till mine pops is done, and we can.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's wait till yours are done, and you can show the final result on your end, and then we'll.
Sure.
Okay. So let's talk about something that we always love to talk about, which is Ava Gardner.
That's right.
Ava is like the gift that keeps on giving. Before we started recording, we were talking about how there's so many great recipes of hers that we want to keep trying. And she's such a fascinating person, both on film and behind the scenes. So I feel like it's kind of endless, the discussions that we can have about her.
Yeah, we hit it. I was telling you earlier in preparation for this, I rewatched our previous episode, where we cooked Ava's holiday cheese ball recipe, and I was trying to see. I didn't want to talk. I wanted to try and talk about different stuff. We covered a lot of ground in that. We did a lot of high level stuff, and we can certainly hit back on some of those. But yeah, she just lived a really full life. And she was, even though she passed away at, I believe she was 67 when she passed away. So she was relatively young, but, she got her start in Hollywood as a teenager. So she was ultimately in the public consciousness for such a long time. And she just had, her life took so many different, twists and turns that were always kind of unconventional. And she was very much a free spirit, an independent spirit, and lived her life on her terms, and is just a very fascinating person that you can constantly find something new to be interested about or to talk about. And so that's what's been great. As we've said before, I work with the museum that's dedicated to her, the Ava Gardner Museum, and we've just started our own kind of online series. We're doing a series called Ava Chats, where we have a different topic and we do a deep dive into, either something about a film or something that's tied to one of the exhibits that we're doing, or we just did a special episode for Valentine's Day, which you joined us for, which I'm so where we talk there were 3 of us involved. I was one of the participants in the kind of panel discussion, and each of us took a husband and did kind of a deep dive, into that. Just saying, when you learn more about her and you learn kind of her strong connections to home and to family, which, really ties into this recipe and some of the other recipes we talked about trying to prepare in the future. Family and all that was very important to her, and that kind of intimate private life was very important to her. And I think that's true for a lot of the stars that were such public figures, that having that respite from the spotlight and kind of having a place to go away. And she famously left Hollywood, left America, kind of at the pit, almost sort of the pinnacle of her career. She just packed up and moved to Europe and lived in Spain, and then spent the rest of her life in England, living in London. And she just, that's very unusual for that time to not like seek out the spotlight. Although she still acted and still performed in all sorts of productions, she kind of got away from it and was more concerned about her own life and what was healthy and made her happy and brought her joy. And living there and being away from the scrutiny of paparazzi and constant camera glare and the press. And then coming home, and she came home a lot for the remainder of her life, visited home and would come home and stay with one of her siblings and spend time, just hanging out with them. And they would have big family dinners and, just kind of relax barefoot and just see her families and friends. And her brother, Jack, was involved in all sorts of things. He was a politician. He was a local businessman, and he had several businesses in and around Smithfield. Some of the buildings are still there. And he had a little restaurant called I can't remember if it was a little burger joint. I can't remember the name of it, but the building is still there. It may have even been called like the In-N-Out Burger or something kind of like that. And she would come home and she would go there and work the cash register and, be behind the counter flipping burgers and that kind of, and just, people would come in and be like, what?
Can you imagine walking in there and you're like, Ava Gardner.
Yeah,
Oh my
exactly.
goodness.
And I love those kinds of stories to talk about. You know, it's great to talk about the star and the films they made, because that's obviously how we got into them and how we remember them, and the lasting legacy that they have. But also kind of knowing those personal stories about family and home, and how people were, you know, on the screen versus kind of in the private world, and what they were like to their friends and family. And, you know, a lot of the stuff that she did in terms of supporting her, you know, being engaged with her family, or being, you know, she was, all her nieces and nephews talk about what a great aunt she was, and she loved doting on the nieces and nephews in her family and all. And but you know, and she would send them gifts and all sorts of, and they'd go visit her. And you know, and it's just great to kind of hear those stories, because it puts such a personal perspective beyond the body of work that they left behind. And so much of those interactions that she had were very, very intimate. They weren't done for the press or for recognition or for anything beyond that. Just that she was a good, you know, seemed to be a really good person and really loved her family. And so I think all that's really neat to learn those kinds of stories. And getting to work with the museum is been a conduit for me to kind of get involved and learn those stories beyond this kind of surface level of what I already knew about her.
One thing I've kind of observed, having worked at production companies and Hollywood and stuff, is celebrities are kind of hounded almost 24/7 of people want something from them, be it read my script, sign my autograph, support my charity, show up at my award show, just nonstop, wear my gown, whatever it is. And I bet even back then it was probably very intense as well. And being with family and friends, or working the cash register in North Carolina, that was probably a taste of normal for her, and a world where they didn't care that she's an A-list movie star. It's like, well, you know, you're just one of us, you're part of the family. And that had to have been like kind of oxygen for someone in an environment where you're sort of in this goldfish bowl with everybody looking at you and scrutinizing you. It had to have been very refreshing to live life outside of that.
Yeah,
situation.
absolutely. And you know, I don't know that I mean, obviously she, you know, her life and her beauty and her talent and all that led her down the path of being a star. And that was those were the cards she was dealt, and she, you know, made the most of that and enjoyed her life. You know, and she says in her autobiography, you know, kind of, honey, I wouldn't do it any differently, you know, if I had to do it over again, kind of thing. And she, you know, that's a testament to that she did ultimately, even though she had to make hard decisions from, you know, time to time, and she went into relationships and things expecting them to last and to, you know, all that, and they sometimes didn't work out, and that was hard for her. But she was plucky, you know, she kind of always kept going and kept saying, you know, I'm gonna, you know, blaze my own path and all that. But home, Smithfield and that area, and her siblings, they were there. They were always there, and they knew her. And you know, her oldest siblings kind of had a motherly relationship with her. You know, the siblings sort of closer in age, where it was more sibling-like. But you know, she was, you know, a rambunctious wild child, and they all had stories about her, you know, climbing a water tower or jumping off, you know, going to the local sawmill and jumping off the pile of sawdust and all that. She was always kind of, you know, she had a zest for life even as a child, which is kind of neat that carried over into her adult life, and all the stories that you hear about her, you know, especially the fun she had in Spain, and going to the bullfights and going out flamingo dancing and all that. You know, that zest and all that was always a component of that. But she could come here, and it just, you know, North Carolina, and this part of North Carolina at the time especially, was so far removed from that life, from Hollywood, from all of that. And she could be here, and it would have been amazing to me in the 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s, you know, in her lifetime, if you know, somebody from the paparazzi was in rural North Carolina to bug her. She never had to worry about that. So it really was a place of respite. And you can understand, you know, at the end of her life, while she did make the choice to come back home, to be buried here, to be buried with her family, because they always were the core of her, and they were always a comfort to her, especially as she got older and started having some health issues. Her sister Myra, who was, again, closest in age. And Myra passed away, I believe, in 2005. So she was the last of the children to pass away. You know, they were very close and a lot of comfort to each other in their older years. And Ava Gardner actually set up, you know, one of the things we talked about in the episode that we did, the museum did, of Ava Chats, where we talked about her 3 marriages. One of the things we wanted to do with that episode was dispel some of the common myths that come about with each, you know, romance. And there's a lot of myths and rumors that are, you know, kind of dog the stories of all stars, but there's several ones that are associated with Ava that we try to combat and tell the true story. And one of the things that constantly comes up with her is that Frank Sinatra supported her in her later life, and that he paid for her funeral and all that sort of stuff. And that's not the case. We have, you know, when she passed away, or before she passed away, she set up a living trust that she started in, I believe it was 1986. And she set it up so it could look after her two living siblings, Myra being one of them, and then the oldest sibling, Beatrice or Bappy. They both outlived her, but she set up that so that her estate could benefit them and look after them. And then it was written in such a way that after their passing, anything that was left over or any future earnings off of licensing rights and that sort of thing to her image and name would be set up to solely benefit charities. And she designated a couple charities, and over time those have had to change because certain organizations have closed, but there are 3 charities that they benefit now. One is the Queen's Victoria Hospital in London, where she received treatment when she had an injury falling off a horse and had a hematoma on her face. And she received treatment there and always was very fond of the hospital and the doctors that treated her. And so she set that up. And then her siblings designated other charities, one of which is the Ava Gardner Museum. And the newest one that has just been designated is St. Jude's. So her life and legacy continues to this day beyond, you know, her films and all that. And she had the foresight to look after her siblings and to try and take care of them after her passing, and that she did. And then after their passing, they you know, made sure everything was set up so her legacy could continue to give back. And I think that's really special, and that speaks a lot to kind of her roots and her home life and her family and kind of the value set that they had as a family.
I love it whenever my guests debunk myths, because I feel like film history in particular is so rife with things that aren't accurate. And I think a lot of people have the attitude of never let the truth interfere with a good story.
That's right.
I mean, I think that these people deserve the truth. They deserve accuracy. Just because they were a movie star, why should we just spin lies about them? And that's okay. Because to me, you know, I think that the truth is better, and it's always more interesting as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, I mean, and I'll be the first to say, you know, when I first kind of I got into Hollywood and classic film, you know, as long as I can remember, I've been into old movies, if you want to call them that, and have loved kind of everything associated with, you know, the fashion, the culture, the stars, the music, all of that. That's always been a hallmark of my personality and my taste. And when I first started kind of going, well, I want to read more about the stars, you know, and started getting autobiographies from the library and kind of amassing my own collection of books, you know, it's great to read those, but sometimes they are very, you know, sort of salacious and juicy, and, you know, like, I don't know. And with Ava, because I'm not yet like an Avatologist, but I feel like I'm getting close. Maybe one day I can claim that. All of us that are fans of hers and involved with the museum and stuff can claim that title. But I've tried to get every book that's ever written about her. I have a couple out there that I'm hunting for, and Larry Edmonds, bless them, they're great about it. They've helped me track down some. But, you know, I try to read everything I can, and I've started expanding that to kind of read other people's perspective that fell into her orbit, you know, her co-stars. And I had read some of those books, but kind of, you know, I've just now got, because of doing that Ava Chats episode, I went out and got some of the Mickey Rooney books. So I'm starting to read like his perspective of things. And lots of times you can find where the stories match up, or you can find like the source of the rumor you know, and that rumor I mentioned about Frank Sinatra, that, you know, I don't know the exact source of that, but I know that one of his like business managers at one time, who I'm not sure if he wrote a book or just did a series of interviews, but he's the one who sort of said, yeah, Frank paid for everything, which, like I said, he didn't. He paid for one doctor's visit that he wanted her to go see the specialist, and she didn't want to go. And he said, "Go. I'm going to take her. I want you to go. I want you to, you know, go to it. I'm going to take care of it." So that's really it. And otherwise, you know, she had plenty of money, and, you know, managed her money, and left an estate that was able to start this trust, and is still with us to, you know, 30 years after her passing in 1990, almost 31 years. You know, it's still going strong and still benefiting organizations and doing things, charitable things in her name. So, you know, that's a quick way to debunk that. But it is fun to be able to say, no, I know that's not right. Let's correct the record on some of those things. So
Definitely. And it seems like the more that they were like a sex symbol or part of a power couple, it seems that the series of myths even grow more so, you know, when that's the case. So yeah, I'm all about.
No, I was just going to agree with you, know, and so many of these stars did have just amazing, they a lot of them did come from humble backgrounds, and they did have an amazing, like, just, you know, such a kind of bit of luck that they were discovered when they were discovered, or how they were discovered, you know, whether in, you know, Schwab's drugstore, or like Ava, because her picture was in the window in New York. That was sort of what led to her discovery, you know, as an 18-year-old. And those stories don't need embellishment. They're great stories
On their own.
You don't need to add anything, because, like you said, the truth is just as interesting, if not more so, most of the time.
I firmly believe that. You know, another thing that I want to ask you about that I love about Ava is that I feel like in our society, women are constantly pitted against each other, and I absolutely hate that and reject it. And one thing that I think is so cool is the friendship between Ava Gardner and Lana Turner. Because here you are, they're the same studio. They're both insanely gorgeous, extremely talented, had many shared relationships or boyfriends or acquaintances or whatever, but they were buddies and they hung out, they were friends. There's so many pictures of them laughing and joking, and I love that. That makes me so happy every time I see pictures of them together.
Funny you should mention that. I was recently reread, you know, I like I said, and I'm sure you're the same, I've amassed quite a collection of Hollywood related books.
Yes.
And I, you know, have a lot that I read long before I was involved with the Ava Gardner Museum or doing work to kind of share her life and legacy. So I've been trying to go back through my older books and be like, I feel like they met or they did something, you know, I know they made this movie together. What does this book say about her? And what's the story that, you know, is there a good quotation I could pull or something like that for something for the blog or website for the museum? So I'm trying to kind of do that. It's going to take forever because I have a huge bookshelf of more books that I know what to do with half the time. But I was looking back through Esther Williams' autobiography. I don't know if you've ever read that one.
I have. It's a good one.
It's got some story, you know, it's got a few moments of salacious
I
stuff.
agree.
But there are some gems in there, and there is this. She mentions Ava in one particular instance. She says that they were all attending this big party that Marion Davies was hosting, and Marion Davies, it was at her house, and she had taken her house and sort of turned it into different nightclubs where there was like sort of a replica of the Stork Club or Ciro's or Chasen's or something like that, and had it all broken up like that, and had kind of assigned tables. And Esther Williams arrived with her husband, Ben, I can't remember his last name.
I can't either, but I know you're talking about. He was like the second.
Her then husband, Ben, whatever his last name was. And they got there and they were seated at the table with Arlene Dahl and her then husband, Lex Barker. It was Barker, yeah. And so they were seated there. And then Fernando Lamas came in, and he was married to Lana at the time, and he had Lana on one arm and Ava on the other. And there's some photos of the three of them going to this event. So, you know, it's true that they were there. And then they come and they're seated at the same table. And Esther said that it was such a table of like romantic musical chairs because
I remember that quote. Yeah.
because Lana had ended up having an affair with Lex.
I think she married Lex, but had the affair with Fernando.
What's that?
I think she married Lex and had the affair with Fernando.
Well,
It's very confusing.
But it was like they all shared. The only and of course Ava, was married to Mickey, and Lana may or may not have had a little fling with Mickey, and they were both married. Both Lana and Ava were married to Artie Shaw, and but Lana had a relationship with Frank, although brief, and of course Ava married. So they shared all of those relationships, and then Lana and Molly were both married to Lex, both married to Fernando, and then of course Esther Williams later married Fernando. So they all sort of it was just a table swap of that. But that's you're right. Lana Turner and Ava Gardner. I mean, I can't. It'd be hard to kind of imagine. I've never been in that situation where I'm friends with somebody, like the ex-girlfriend or wife of somebody I've dated. I've never put myself in that situation or been in that situation. But you can tell that their friendship and their bond transcended all of that. And they advised each other. I mean, Lana said, don't marry Artie. He's not, that's not going to, and don't marry him. But Ava did it anyway because she loved him. But yeah, that's so neat to kind of see how their friendship transcended all of that, all the potential drama around that. So
yeah, and because the conventional wisdom would have been to think, oh, they must hate each other's guts. They must be these bitter, dueling glamour queen rivals. And the fact that they were buddies, I think, is just like the coolest thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And stayed, and they both spoke very. I mean, I don't know, kind of, they. I don't know. It's probably because Ava moved away and they didn't see each other much. But they both speak very fondly of each other in Lana Turner's interviews and her book. And Ava spoke very kindly of both of them. In fact, Ava said, when she first got to Hollywood, and Lana was already, she was a year and a half older than Ava. She was already there and had, was a sort of more established star, and certainly was an established star long before. It took Ava 5 years to get The Killers and Whistle Stop and all that before her career started to take off. So it took her a while, but she said the first time she saw Lana, she was a little starstruck. She was like, she saw her, dressed, in her costume, in a chair with a gold cigarette case, and she was like, "That's what a star should look like," was what she thought. So, so that's great that she could start off sort of a little starstruck by her almost. But yeah, they did become fast friends, and you can see in all the pictures that are taken of them, especially the ones like around that the ribbon ball, those really great photos. You can tell they're just having a great time with each other. Laughing and talking, and it would be fun to be a fly on the wall for those conversations.
I was just thinking that would be absolutely fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
My whole kitchen is smelling like warm cinnamon right now. Oh, it's so good.
Yay! Hopefully, it's not going to explode with the yeast. We'll see.
Fingers crossed. We're going to see how this works out. This is definitely an experimental move on my part. So tell me about some of Ava's other friendships with other women. And can you talk about those?
Yeah, you mentioned, kind of her high profile friendships. She was a lifelong friend with Lena Horne, and that's another instance where, Lena Horne was just such an amazing trailblazer, and came to Hollywood with so intentionally with, these are the kind of roles I'm going to do. These are the kind of people I'm going to portray, and I'm not going to do, I'm not going to compromise that. And she famous, there's kind of the famous, what you would think, again, you think that they would have been pitted against each other because of the situation around Showboat. And we can talk a little bit about that, but, the role in Showboat of Julie Laverne was tailor-made for Lena Horne. And she was, cast in the biopic of Jerome Kern, who, was Jerome. It was a Kern and Hammerstein production, Showboat, the music and all. And they did a biopic of Jerome Kern that was released shortly after his passing. And they did little vignettes within that film from some of his stage productions. And they did several sequences, quite kind of the longest set of sequences within the film are from Showboat, and they recreated kind of what the stage production was like. And in the kind of that sequence within the film, they cast Lena Horne as Julie Laverne. And she sang, Can't Help Loving That Man of Mine. And I can't remember what other, if she sang Bill in that, but she just totally, embodied that role, and it was just perfect for her. So when they got around, a couple of years later they planned to do a remake of Showboat that was ultimately released in 1951. Lena Horne lobbied for that role. She thought, well, I've already done it. Can't I do it? Can I do it for real? Can I do the full length, role? Because it's my dream role. And unfortunately, because of the sentiment of the time and concerns about the Southern market and just the racism that persisted in Hollywood, she was ultimately not cast because they didn't want to cast a Black actress in that role because she would be playing opposite a white actor, and it's ridiculous to even think about that. But that's the story. The character of Julie Laverne is someone of mixed race and is combating that and kind of living in this world of the showboat and the riverboat and all, living that life. So it would make perfect sense to cast someone that is a Black actress that could speak and bring a level of authenticity to that role. But unfortunately, the studio decided not to, and they talked about a few other actresses, including Dinah Shore, for the role. But ultimately, they landed on Ava Gardner. And when Ava was practicing, she was the studio dictated what she did, so she didn't have a whole lot of choice. So, she and Lena had been friends. They were friends from kind of the beginning of when Ava arrived. Lena had already been in Hollywood several years, or a couple years at least. And they became fast friends. They even were neighbors for a period of time. They liked to go to listen to jazz music together. And they had a great friendship and a great rapport. And they talked about this in that time when it happened. Ava said to Lena, "You're the one that should play this role. You're the right one for this role. I shouldn't be playing it. It should be you." And they were both upset about it and both disappointed that Lena didn't get the role. But that being said, Ava, continued and tried to make the most of it. And in fact, when she was learning the music, the studio had her practice to Lena Horne's recordings of the songs, which just added this other layer, kind of, added insult to injury to it. But and then of course, for anybody who doesn't know, Ava practiced really hard to try and sing those songs, and she sang them quite well, I think. When you can go online and hear the recordings of them, and she was actually the record that was produced for the film, it has her singing all the songs that Julie Laverne, that character, sings. So you can hear her voice there, and you can also find the videos on YouTube. And but in the film, they dubbed her voice, and she hated that. She was so, and they had promised her they led her to believe they were going to use her voice, but they ultimately did not, and she was quite upset with that. And so that left a sour taste in her mouth, in addition to what had happened to her friend. But they stayed close, and they, there's great pictures and great things that they did. Years later, Ava Gardner co-hosted a fundraising event for a theater organization that would bring theatrical productions and teach theater and that kind of, and acting to underserved communities in rural parts of primarily the South. But it was an organization based in New Orleans, and Ava hosted a fundraiser for that, and Lena came and performed at it. And so they stayed friends through the rest of their lives. And there's a great interview if anybody's looking for it, and we could share a link, I guess, on your.
Sure.
There's a great link interview that Lena Horne did with Johnny Carson in kind of the Ava was still alive, so it was, I think, the mid 80s, and she was touring and doing a lot of stuff, and she talked about the showboat situation. And she talked so fondly of Ava and says, she's a cool gal or whatever, she's just down to earth and all that. And you could just see how much their friendship, Ava didn't do a lot of interviews. She did very little. She didn't like being kind of in live interview situations. That made her nervous, I think. So she wasn't on, there's not a lot of archived interviews of her. There's a few tape recordings that exist, but not much other than that. So to see Lena Horne talk about her in that kind of fun setting of the Johnny Carson show, and hear kind of, you can hear the friendship that they share in how she speaks about Ava. So that's really special.
That is really cool. And it says a lot about both women, the way they reacted to that situation as well.
And to your point, it dispels that kind of, that myth or that inclination of trying to pit. Certainly there are stars that didn't get along and didn't like each other and did view each other as rivals, whether that was something they did themselves or whether that was something that the studios kind of, you know, exacerbated to some degree. But Lena, you know, Lena and Ava and Lana, and Ava's, you know, she had a companion that sort of served as like a personal assistant for her, named Renee Jordan, who wrote a book called Living with Miss G. And that was a book we talked about a little bit on our last episode that's available through the museum. And that was someone who, you know, came into her life when she was just starting to kind of get on the path to kind of success, and stayed with her and stayed her friend for the rest of her life. And they were incredibly close, intimate friends, and went everywhere together. And, you know, there's stories of them going to nightclubs, and Renee was African-American, and they went into clubs, and, you know, they'd be met with, you know, they'd let Ava in and then they wouldn't want to let Renee in, or Renee would come in and then they would come and ask her to leave because she was Black. And Ava would say, you know, well, if she goes, I go. So you better decide. You know, and she stood up for people, and she did, you know, that kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier. So many of those interactions and so many of those kind of anecdotal stories that have been shared and passed down are so intimate, and they're so about, you know, the closeness of family and friendships that aren't meant for the spotlight, that aren't, you know, I'm doing something nice so the press can cover me. You know, they aren't like a PR stunt. They're just who that person was at their core. And when faced with, you know, kind of the impacts of prejudice or that sort of thing, you know, she would, you know, try to, as best she could, you know, in those circumstances, stand up for her friends, or be there for her friends, or commiserate with her friends, or say, you know, she writes quite extensively about the showboat situation in Ava, My Story, and just says, you know, to this day, Lena should have played that role, and I hate that she didn't, and she would have been perfect for it. You know, so to even be reflecting on that toward the end of her life, when she was working on her autobiography and all, you can tell that the friendship was more important than the role, or the friendship was more important than the romance, you know, in a lot of those situations. So
yeah, Ava strikes me as having been a very real and very genuine person.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely right. I hear a beep, so we might have a buckle. Let me go check. I'll be right back.
I'm going to check my buckle as well.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Can you see that?
Oh, that looks so good.
Here it is. And as it kind of, you know, you bring it out of the oven and you let it rest just a little bit because it's too hot to eat right at the beginning. But it'll kind of sink a little bit. The streusel will kind of, you know, it's risen up at this point, but it'll sink down a little bit. And the recipe recommends serving it with ice cream or whipped cream. Growing up, when we had cobbler, we would always use a little bit of evaporated milk, or half and half over that. So that's really good too, to add a little bit of a cream element to it. So, but I think it's a winner. I think it's a great, really easy, you know, pretty easy dessert, depending on the flour situation.
Well, I just checked mine, and mine does have a little bit longer to go, but I think the yeast did its thing, because it looks a lot taller in there than it did the first time. So yeah. I think it's going to work out okay. And I will definitely post a picture when it's done.
Absolutely. Wonderful.
Well, this was another fantastic episode of Hollywood Kitchen. Laura, thank you so much for joining me. And there are still so many great Ava Gardner recipes to do in the future. So I really hope that you will join me again.
I'll be happy to. Would love it.
Excellent. And thank you so much thank you for joining me, and thank you to everybody at the Ava Gardner Museum. You guys really do some great online programming. The museum is so nice, and I really look forward to visiting it again after the pandemic.
Thank you. And like I said, thanks for joining we've got our virtual series that we're doing, and we're trying to adapt some of our exhibits to virtual exhibits so we can further kind of help reach folks and help folks that can't actually physically come see us can come and join us online and get the benefit of learning about the research that we've done or the artifacts that we have to share. So check out avagardner.org to find out more about upcoming events and that sort of thing. But thanks so much for this. I have such a ball doing these with you, and I would love to come back. And like I said, I can talk about Ava. One day I'll be a true avatologist.
Oh, I think you already are. I think you are.
Well, thanks so much, and it's just been a pleasure. And I hope everybody likes the buckle. Let us know.
Yes, tag us. Oh, hashtag cooking with Ava.
Yes, hashtag cooking with Ava. Yeah, we shared, if you want to go back and look on the blog, we have this recipe, and Carrie will share it on her website. We have other ones that we've shared. And if there's one that everybody really likes, and we'll try to do it, maybe the next time we'll do another poll and see what folks want us to prepare. But so there's lots of great recipes to check out if you search, hashtag cooking with Ava. So.
And also hashtag Hollywood Kitchen as well.
Hashtag Hollywood Kitchen. Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.